Thanks, Chris. Yeah, it's a really weird full circle moment to be up here. I remember, I remember being 4 and playing with a microphone on stage and pretending to sing or something like that. And then someone was like, "Oh, you're gonna be up there one day," and I was like, "No, I'm too scared." But here I am. So it's just exciting for me to be able to be here and to share with you. I know that some of you know who I am and are familiar with me, others of you are not, so thank you for your grace and your welcome as I speak today. Tyler said I could choose anything I wanted to preach on, which is a little bit daunting because there's a lot in the Bible to talk about, so I was a little challenged by that, but I figured, you know what, it's New Year's Eve, let's start there and see what happens. So we find ourselves at the end of another year. It's another winter, spring, summer, and fall that have passed. Another Lent, Easter, Advent, and Christmas have come and gone. The new year invites reflection on the past and aspirations for the year to come. For some of us, this time is really motivational and exciting. We're ready to make those New Year's resolutions, those goals, ready for a fresh start. For others, there's nothing new that comes with the new year. It's just another January, nothing special about it. And then maybe even for others, the new year brings about disappointment or feelings of being lost. For some people, it's discouraging. There is no expectation that life can be better than it is. In recent months, I've been wrestling with the dynamics of sorrow and joy, despair and hope, and what it means to experience all of these honestly in light of who Jesus is. Personally, I've become discouraged lately because I find myself in a season of spiritual loneliness. A few people who are close to me have been in a process of deconstructing their faith, and it's left us all in different spots when it comes to our relationship with Jesus and the church. And while thinking critically about your faith is necessary, I have noticed that the questioning and the failures of the church in particular have led some of my peers to a place of cynicism. And I don't want to minimize the pain that many of them have gone through, especially the pain that was done in the name of Jesus. Their questions are valid, and many of them I have asked myself. However, I can't help but think that cynicism was never the place we were meant to end up. If I call myself Christian, I must hold on to a sense of radical hope in the face of the world's brokenness. But how can this be done? What is the hope that Christians cling to? It's easy for us to become accustomed to the hope that we have, becoming blind to how radical it truly is. Because every year we revisit the Christmas story. We proclaim Jesus' death and resurrection. But these rituals fall flat if they find no meaning apart from their appointed season. The task of the Christian is to constantly live and relive the story of Jesus' birth, life, death, resurrection, and ascension. We must become aware of the ways this story is shaping our lives and how the Holy Spirit is working in the here and now. But how can we do this when the world seems constantly filled with the same discouraging stories? Another war begun, so-called Christian leaders abusing their power, an epidemic of loneliness. When we look around us, it is easy to think that there is nothing new under the sun. Life is but a vapor, and meaning is lost to us. This is the character of cynicism I see all around me, a sort of blindness to the reality of the Spirit indwelling us, a belief that somehow it is only up to us humans to effect change in the world. The dynamics of hope and lament in a fallen world are not easily discernible. How can we voice our honest fears and frustrations while clinging to the hope that one day things will be different? The biblical story is one which consistently wrestles with this dynamic. So this morning, in light of the new year, I wanted to focus on 2 Psalms which illuminate this relationship between expressing our sorrow and clinging to hope. I, by no means, will be able to cover the full scope of these themes in the Psalms or in Scripture, but I just want to illuminate this relationship and dynamic that is throughout the gospel story. So, before I launch into the 2 Psalms, part of which we heard Chris read this morning, I wanted to do a bit of a Psalms overview so that we understand the context of the book. My survey of the book will be brief, but I hope that we can keep this larger context in mind as we take a close look at Psalms 39 and 40. So for some of us, Psalms may feel like a really familiar book. It is coined as the book that teaches us how to pray, offering words for the community of faith for thousands of years. In my own experience, Psalms are often turned to randomly or in search of words which will match a particular experience I'm having. My use of the Psalms has been one which is largely private, but the scope of this book is far greater than a selection of poems I can use as daily devotions. Granted, I think the Psalms are extremely useful for personal prayer, but this is not their sole purpose. The book of Psalms is a selection of poems which have been carefully crafted into a larger work with a unified purpose. Many of these Psalms, though not all, are attributed to David, whose personal journey is recounted in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. The details from these historical books illuminate the meaning within these Psalms, and they highlight the royal orientation of them. Bruce Waltke, in his commentary on the Psalms, writes that fundamentally the Psalms are both by and about the king. The Psalter can be thought of as a royal hymn book, and its individual Psalms have the house of David as its subject matter and point of reference. As we will discuss a little bit later, this royal orientation is not just in reference to David, but the future king, Jesus Christ. Most Psalms are written to music, and many of them are also meant to be sung communally, not just privately. In fact, it is more likely that Jesus' own familiarity with the Psalms did not come from private recitation, but rather communal singing and reading within a synagogue. The words of the Psalms are words not just for individuals, but for whole communities of faith. As I said earlier, the book of Psalms has been intentionally edited or crafted, and here's what I mean. These poems have existed in Jewish community for centuries, and then they were collected by a group of scribes or a scribe after the exile in Babylon. These poems were arranged in such a way that a prominent message or thematic thread can be traced from beginning to end. Psalms 1 to 2 act as an introduction to the entire Psalter, while Psalms 146 to 150 are the conclusion. Between these bookends are 5 books. Psalms 3 to 72 are books 1 and 2, and they focus more on David's reign and kingship in Israel. Book 3 focuses on the experience of exile, and that would be Psalms 73 to 89. And then the final books, 4 and 5, look forward to the future arrival of the Messiah and the coming of God's kingdom on earth. Taken all together, the Psalms present the entire story of faith. Israel found themselves in a time of waiting for the king who would rescue them from the oppressive empires of the world and rule justly, a time when all of creation would bow down and worship Yahweh. In this story, there are times of mourning, frustration, anger, and despair, because the current situation the Israelites find themselves in is one of exile. The hope is not yet realized. At the same time, there are many songs which express joy, delight, praise, and resolve, because there is an awareness of God's present saving acts and the ones yet to come. There are also a few ways of categorizing the Psalms, but most commonly there are 4 recognized genres: praise, thanksgiving, lament, and the messianic psalms. Most commentators identify stable elements which comprise each of these kinds of psalms. For example, the lament psalms typically involve lament, petition, and an affirmation of hope found in God. But in reality, this genre of the Psalms is not so easily defined. Villanueva, he's a commentator, writes that the movement of the Psalms is one which is highly dynamic. Sometimes the author moves from lament to praise. Sometimes, as we will see, the author moves from praise to lament. Sometimes the author sits in one mode for the entire psalm, like in Psalm 88, which is famously known for being a psalm of only petition and lament. My point in bringing this up is just that Psalms have stable elements, but they move around a lot. Every psalmist is unique and has their own situation that they are talking about and expressing. Walter Brueggemann offers another helpful paradigm for understanding these genres, organizing poems as psalms of orientation, disorientation, and new orientation or reorientation. Songs which are of orientation are praise and thanksgiving psalms, which reflect a sense of stability and trust. The author is oriented towards God as one who is good, and the world as one of order. Psalms of disorientation are ones of lament. The author's stable worldview is cracked or crumbling in the face of adversity. The world no longer seems ordered, and the psalmist wonders if God truly cares about their suffering. In these psalms, the writer honestly faces Yahweh with pleas and petition. Many of the words they use are harsh and emotional. And then psalms of new orientation recognize and look forward to a new situation which God brings. Brueggemann writes, "These psalms, psalms of new orientation, affirm a sovereign God who puts humankind in a new situation. The move of the season is transformational and not developmental. That is, the move is never obvious, easy, or natural. It is always in pain and surprise, and in each age it is thinkable that a different move might have been made." I wanted to highlight Psalm 39 and 40 because they clearly show a move from disorientation to new orientation. Part of what inspired me to speak on this topic was actually my very last Hebrew language class of the semester. We took some time to translate the last few verses of Psalm 39 and the beginning of Psalm 40. Being able to sit with these words longer and work a lot harder to understand them helped me to see the strong dynamic between lament and hope. They form a unit together which describes two sides of the same experience, one which longs for hope and the other rejoicing in it. So now at this time, I'm going to read Psalm 39, and we'll sit with that one for a bit. Psalm 39 says, "I said, I will watch my ways and keep my tongue from sin. I will put a muzzle on my mouth while in the presence of the wicked. So I remained utterly silent, not even saying anything good. But my anguish increased, my heart grew hot within me. While I meditated, the fire burned, then I spoke with my tongue. Show me, Lord, my life's end and the number of my days. Let me know how fleeting my life is. You have made my days a mere handbreadth. The span of my years is as nothing before you. Everyone is but a breath, even those who seem secure. Surely everyone goes around like a mere phantom. In vain they rush about, heaping up wealth without knowing whose it will finally be. But now, Lord, what do I look for? My hope is in you. Save me from all my transgressions. Do not make me the scorn of fools. I was silent, I would not open my mouth, for you are the one who has done this. Remove your scourge from me. I am overcome by the blow of your hand. When you rebuke and discipline anyone for their sin, you consume their wealth like a moth. Surely everyone is but a breath. Hear my prayer, Lord. Listen to my cry for help. Do not be deaf to my weeping. I dwell with you as a foreigner, a stranger as all my ancestors were. Look away from me, that I may enjoy life again before I depart and am no more. So clearly, Psalm 39 is a lament psalm, or a psalm of disorientation, found towards the end of the first book of Psalms. It is attributed to David, but not much can be known about the situation David was in when he wrote it. Doubtless, David had many troubles to write about, but this psalm and its history are difficult to parse. Perhaps it is better that this mystery surrounds the psalm, more easily enabling individuals and communities to step into the thoughts and emotions being expressed. The psalm's introduction is marked by a deep sense of tension. David writes, "I will watch my ways and keep my tongue from sin. I will put a muzzle on my mouth while in the presence of the wicked." Whatever David is thinking and feeling, he is attempting to restrain it. The sense of the psalm is one of deep and powerful emotion, one so powerful that David is aware that it may overtake him and control his speech. But not a verse later, and David stops trying to hold back and says, "But my anguish increased, my heart grew hot within me. While I meditated, the fire burned, then I spoke with my tongue." These first three verses give the impression that David is bursting at the seams. His emotion is too raw, too powerful to be held at bay. The next sequence of verses move into speech which sounds almost like Ecclesiastes or Job. It is lament par excellence. "Show me, Lord, my life's end and the number of my days. Let me know how fleeting my life is." And later in verse 6, "Surely everyone goes around like a mere phantom. In vain they rush about, heaping up wealth without knowing whose it will finally be." David here is struggling to find meaning and purpose within his struggle. This move to reflect on the apparent futility of life is one which is all too human. Job, in his many speeches, laments his own birth, wishing he had never appeared on earth in the first place. Likewise, the book of Ecclesiastes is marked with a similar refrain, meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. I'm sure many of us in our own struggles go to a place of wondering what the point of life is. It is no wonder that the height of depression is the desire to take one's own life. In our pain, distress, and anxiety, it is difficult to see the meaning of our lives. We are left searching for a purpose or a way to simply end the struggle. While many lament psalms express a call to hope, Psalm 39 is one in which the desire for hope is present yet muted. Only verse 7 concerns itself with hope. The rest of the psalm reflects petition and lament again. It reads, "But now, Lord, what do I look for? My hope is in you." This sentence on its own may sound quite confident, but based on the context of the verse and the others which surround it, this call to hope appears desperate, almost with an air of futility. It is not necessarily spoken in joy, but with a sense that there is simply nowhere else to turn. Not only is God named as responsible for hope, but David also vocalizes that he believes God to be the source of his affliction. He writes, "I was silent, I would not open my mouth, for you are the one who has done this." The final verses spell this out even more clearly. "Hear my prayer, Lord. Listen to my cry for help. Do not be deaf to my weeping. I dwell with you as a foreigner, a stranger, as all my ancestors were. Look away from me that I may enjoy life again before I depart and am no more." Just as Job spoke, David knows that the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. The words in this psalm are soaked in emotions of sadness, despair, fatigue, and futility. While there is a petition to God and the belief that there is something which he can do about David's situation, this is not a rousing call to hope as much as we would like it to be. David is sitting in emotions which we have all encountered in the darkest moments of our lives. Those times when God feels most far away, when he feels more like the perpetrator of our distress rather than the one who comforts us. This is the kind of psalm which feels disorienting indeed. Nothing is as it should be. What is important to keep in mind about a psalm such as this one is not to draw too many conclusions about God's character just yet. What is more important and more helpful is to recognize that lament has an important place in the prayer life of the community of faith. Whether David's assumptions about God are correct or not, we know from this poem that to express these feelings we have, even to express our thoughts about God, whatever they may be, are permissible. And permissible may even be too soft of a word. I would go to say that it's necessary. For true prayers are ones which do not hold back the truth about our situations. Already, hope is beginning to spring from these poems of sadness, for through them we know we have a God who is not insulted, nor does he fear our honest emotions. At the same time, Psalms cannot be read alone. The story does not end there. What I want to make more abundantly clear is that lament is a necessary state to be in, but it is not one which we are meant to stay in forever. Especially as Christians, the story we preach to the world is one which is, at its core, utterly hopeful. We will now turn to Psalm 40 to have a better grasp of this hopeful dynamic we find throughout the Bible. Psalm 40 says, "I waited patiently for the Lord. He turned to me and heard my cry. He lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire. He set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand. He put a new song in my mouth, a hymn of praise to our God. Many will see and fear the Lord and put their trust in him. Blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, who does not look to the proud, to those who turn aside to false gods. Many, Lord my God, are the wonders you have done, the things you planned for us. None can compare with you. Were I to speak and tell of your deeds, they would be too many to declare. Sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but my ears you have opened. Burnt offerings and sin offerings you did not require. Then I said, here I am, I have come. It is written about me in the scroll. I desire to do your will, my God. Your law is within my heart. I proclaim your saving acts in the great assembly. I do not seal my lips, Lord, as you know. I do not hide your righteousness in my heart. I speak of your faithfulness and your saving help. I do not conceal your love and your faithfulness from the great assembly. Do not withhold your mercy from me, Lord. May your love and faithfulness always protect me. For troubles without number surround me. My sins have overtaken me, and I cannot see. They are more than the hairs of my head, and my heart fails within me. Be pleased to save me, Lord. Come quickly, Lord, to help me. May all who want to take my life be put to shame and confusion. May all who desire my ruin be turned back in disgrace. May those who say to me, aha, aha, be appalled at their own shame. But may all who seek you rejoice and be glad in you. May those who long for your saving help always say, the Lord is great. But as for me, I am poor and needy. May the Lord think of me. You are my help and my deliverer. You are my God. Do not delay. If you're a fan of the band U2, there's a chance that you may have a good chunk of this psalm memorized. 40 is the name of the last song on U2's album War, which was released in 1983, and it is a modern rendition of Psalm 40. Bet some of you are surprised I know about this album. My parents were surprised too. I actually think that the whole album is a really good example of a collection of modern-day psalms. Largely a reflection on the conflict in Northern Ireland, this album wrestles with the violence and the brokenness of our world. The first song, Sunday, Bloody Sunday, was a political protest. It is structured a lot like a lament. The repeated refrain singing, how long must we sing this song? How long, how long? And the song 40 turns this refrain into a song of hope, saying, I will sing a new song. What U2 has done in their album War is much like what the psalmist has done with Psalm 39 and 40. Psalm 39 honestly voices a lamenting cry, and it does not necessarily end on a note of hope. Quite literally, a new song is needed to bring hope back into the picture. Psalm 40 is placed after Psalm 39 as this hopeful refrain, just as U2 ends their reflective and darker album with the words, I will sing a new song. The disoriented David in Psalm 39 has now moved to a place of new orientation. The final words of Psalm 39 read, hear my prayer, Lord, listen to my cry for help. Do not be deaf to my weeping. And Psalm 40 opens with, I waited patiently for the Lord. He turned to me and heard my cry. This is an exact reversal of David's previous words. The Lord has both heard his cry, as opposed to being deaf, and he has turned toward David rather than looking away. In Hebrew, there are two words for hope. Yachal, which means to wait for, and kavah, which means also to wait. In Psalm 39, verse 7, actually, both of these words are used. David says, and now, Lord, what can I kavah for? You are my yachal. The NLT translates it as, and so, Lord, where do I put my hope? My only hope is in you. In the biblical authors' minds, the experience of hope is inextricably linked to waiting. In an Advent video on hope, the Bible Project actually does a really excellent word study of this. Tim Mackey explains that the root word for the verb kavah is kav, which means tight or tight cord. It brings to mind an image of tension. He defines kavah then not as just waiting or hope, but tense expectations. From the biblical perspective, to hope is not an act of shallow optimism. Rather, it is a continuous and active waiting for something to change. Psalm 40 begins with this verb, kavah. Verse 1 reads, I waited patiently for the Lord. And it sounds really nice, especially after a more depressing line before it. But as often happens with translations, the true sense of this sentence has been muted a little bit. In Hebrew, the psalm begins with the infinitive absolute form of the verb kavah. And I know that some of you are thinking, what does that mean? So I'll try to explain this a little bit better in English. So in English, we have past, present, and future tense verbs. But in Hebrew, there's a few other verb tenses, and one of them is the infinitive absolute. So this is when a verb is repeated twice using the infinitive absolute form and the regular form of the verb. So 40 verse 1 reads, kavo kaviti, which translated literally means I waited. The purpose of the infinitive absolute is to intensify an action. So usually in translations, they'll put the word I surely did something. So we could say I surely waited. But even this is too muted. The sense of the verb tense is more that David has really waited, like really, really waited. I think that Eugene Peterson's version, the Message version, actually does a really good job of translating this sentence. He translates it as, I waited and waited and waited for God. At last he looked. Finally he listened. This reveals just how fervently David has waited and hoped for God to act. It expresses that tension that's in the word kavah. While I was writing this sermon, my husband Jake was reading The Two Towers from The Lord of the Rings. Some of you will know this story, others may not, so I'll try to fill in the context. At this point in the story, Gandalf the Grey is assumed to be dead, but he's now reappeared as Gandalf the White, and he's explaining this to Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, the heroes of the story. Aragorn asks Gandalf where they should go next, perhaps to their hobbit friends who are with Treebeard, really tall, talking tree guy. And Gandalf says, no, that is not the road you must take. I have spoken words of hope, but only of hope. Hope is not victory. This may sound bleak, but Gandalf is expressing what hope truly is. It is not the victory itself, but the expectation that one day the victory will come. And this is what sets hope apart from optimism. It's not the belief that everything is as it should be. Rather, it is the admittance that everything is not as it should be, and yet we choose to hope in the face of it. A few pages later in the story, as Aragorn and his friends discuss their travel plans with Gandalf, Legolas asks if they will ever see the hobbits again, to which Gandalf replies, I did not say so. Who knows? Have patience, go where you must go, and hope. The task the three friends have in front of them is not easy, and if you've seen The Lord of the Rings, you know there's a lot of pain on the way to victory. They do not know if they will succeed, and they don't know if they will see their hobbit friends again, but they are told to yet hope. Intense expectation, which makes the end of the story all the more surprising. As Brueggemann writes, the movement from lament to hope is always in pain and surprise. Hope is always about waiting for that new orientation, for God to act in a way surprising and transformational. As we wait and hope, we may not feel absolutely certain about the outcome. Rather, we trust that something newer, something better than our current situation will come about. And what we find in Psalm 40 is that God has acted. David has been surprised by God's action, placing him in a new situation. He writes, He lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire. He set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand. He put a new song in my mouth, a hymn of praise to our God. Many will see and fear the Lord and put their trust in him. David has experienced a reorientation from his previous lament. He is singing a new song. Part of this new orientation is a reversal of some of his old ways of thinking. In verse 6, David says, Sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but my ears you have opened. Burnt offerings and sin offerings you did not require. David's earlier plea to God to not be deaf to him has actually been reversed. David finds that perhaps he has been the deaf one, and his early preconceptions about the way God will listen to him have been changed. It is not his offerings which bring him into God's presence. It is obedience. Verse 8 reads, I desire to do your will, my God. Your law is within my heart. This hope which David has found is transforming his worldview. Verse 9 offers another interesting parallel with Psalm 39. David says, I proclaim your saving acts in the great assembly. I do not seal my lips, Lord, as you know. Though David has changed his mind on some things, he does not regret speaking. His hope has not driven him to silence. Rather, it has encouraged him to speak even more, though the words may be different. Along these lines, Psalm 40 does not end the way it begins. In fact, it ends with lament and petition, an example of the Psalms not always following the rules that we expect them to. The rest of the Psalm, beginning at verse 11 to the end, expresses difficult situation that he still finds himself in, and the plea that he gives to God. He says, Do not withhold your mercy from me, Lord. May your love and faithfulness always protect me. For troubles without number surround me. My sins have overtaken me, and I cannot see. They are more than the hairs of my head, and my heart fails within me. And then he moves into the petition, ending the psalm with, But as for me, I am poor and needy. May the Lord think of me. You are my help and my deliverer. You are my God. Do not delay. Why would this be? Since it seems that David has been transformed from despair to hope and praise, why would he begin with such hopeful words full of confidence and end back where he started? I don't think it's as simple as saying that David has lost hope so quickly. Rather, I think that his experience of deliverance has not only reoriented his praise, but also his lament. It is precisely because of the hope David has placed in the Lord that he feels he can express even more petition. Brueggemann puts it well: the thanksgiving of the psalm reorients the lament and petition. The movement of Psalm 39 and 40 is one which is dynamic, of movement between lament and hope. U2's rendition of Psalm 40 actually keeps that tension. Not only do they sing, "I will sing a new song," but in the chorus it repeats how long to sing a new song. The experience of hope is one of both pain and joy. We do not enter hope without questions. And while despair is articulated and felt honestly, there's always this move towards hope. There's always a move to reorientation, which then redefines the way we approach our difficult situations. Rather than leading us to blind optimism, hope instead gives us the ability to bring our requests before God again and again, because we wait and hope and trust that God will move on our behalf, as he has done before. The call of Psalms 39 and 40 is to be consistently reorienting ourselves, never lying about our pain, but hoping in spite of it. So where does this leave us in terms of the big picture? I began this sermon by mentioning some of my friends caught in deep lament and cynicism. And I don't want you to hear me saying that asking questions or feeling frustrated with the church or feeling far from God are experiences we should never have. There are countless examples in Scripture which highlight the importance of expressing suffering honestly. The prophets all attest to this. Job exemplifies this, and Ecclesiastes wrestles with it. What I want to highlight, however, is that lament is never the end of the story. The biblical story is one which is always being reoriented by hope. It is one where God's people intensely expect him to do a new thing. Psalm 39 and 40 is just a snapshot of this dynamic within Scripture, but I believe that it is a dynamic which is at the heart of our faith. As Christians, we believe in a God who does not shy away from suffering, but intentionally responds to it. In the beginning of Exodus, God rescues the Hebrew people simply because he heard their cries. As he takes up residence with the Israelites, his character is described as being bent towards mercy, though he is also just. Isaiah laments deeply about the waywardness of his people and the punishment they will face, and yet half of the book expresses the hope that Yahweh will one day restore them completely. When Jesus is born, he comes not as a warrior king, but as a vulnerable child, and as he grows up and begins his ministry, he confuses his followers because the hope he brings does not match their expectations. The biggest surprise of hope comes when Jesus meets his death on the cross and is raised 3 days later. It was a move nobody was expecting God to make. It fit nobody's expectations, but it is exactly the kind of reorienting hope that God is all about enacting. The messianic hope which the book of Psalms expresses, that longing for the Davidic king to bring God's kingdom to earth, has been fulfilled in Jesus. The hope we have today is that Jesus is king, which means everything is changed. The world is no longer dictated by sin, and no, I'm not talking about just making mistakes. I mean capital S sin, that sin that makes us think we are the kings and God is not. That pervasive force that drives us to exploit one another and abuse power. N.T. Wright says this in his book, Surprised by Hope. He writes, "Hope is what you get when you suddenly realize that a different worldview is possible. A worldview in which the rich, the powerful, and the unscrupulous do not, after all, have the last word. The lament brought on by the suffering caused by sin is never the last word. Jesus has issued a new way of being. He has given us his Spirit, which enables us to become more like him, more loving, more compassionate, more merciful, more just. It is never the case that we should always feel happy and in good spirits about our situation. Quite the opposite. Part of the good news is that we will suffer, but the suffering is not the end of the story. My hope today is that all of us can be amazed once again at the story we find ourselves in. We have waited and waited and waited, and God has acted in history. And it is precisely because of Jesus that we can now continue to wait and hope, with tense expectation that God will act in such a way again. We are encouraged to honestly bring our pain and sorrow to God, as David did in Psalm 39, but we must always remember that we possess good news, really good news. We will all experience death, but our hope is in the resurrection, when our bodies, minds, and souls, every nation, every tongue, every creature, every tree, every mountain, every speck of dirt, will be renewed by God's life. Let's pray. Dear Jesus, thank you for your word, which